Magic the Gathering has a complexity problem, but it's probably not the one you think. Today, I want to talk about component complexity in Magic the Gathering, all the little doodads that we need to play the game now. I want to talk about how we went from decks that fit in boxes like this to decks that need to fit in boxes like this. Because I think there's an interesting story there, and I think it might provide some insight to where we're going next. So pull up a chair, have a seat at the table, and whether you're a button mash hack and slash controller bash, or a meeple moving mastermind of maps, mats, and minis, if you ruffle at the awful ruffle shuffle scuffle, or if you're a click clack pick attack number ball luck sack, we're all here for the same reason. I'm Jake, let's talk games. When I first started playing Magic, I remember watching people play Pokemon and seeing how many different types of counters they had to keep track of, and thinking how obnoxious that would be to have this bag of glass beads with you everywhere you went. Because as a Magic player, all you needed to carry with you was a box that looked like this, or a box that looked like this. 60 cards, unsleeved, of course. And anytime you walked up to somebody who also played Magic, who also had a deck in their pocket, you could immediately play the game. Everyone can count to 20 in their head. Everyone can keep track of a few tokens that are made here and there, just by pulling cards out of the graveyard or exile or even off the bottom of your library. It was a very simple, portable game. And even as cards became more expensive and people wanted to protect them, and people started buying sleeves or boxes that were large enough to hold sleeves, it was still a fairly simple game. But going to Commander Night last night, I realized that one of the new Commander decks that I built, put in a boulder, 100 cards, double sleeved, has the whole deck, has the Commander, but I also need a box with all my tokens, all of the other treasure and map and all sorts of junk, a coin, bag of dice. This is just one deck. And the amount of space that it takes up, I can't put this in my pocket. Obviously, part of this is driven by the fact that it's now convention that every deck is this size. Commander is a larger format. The price of cards typically means that you want to double sleeve things. And so we can't attribute all of this to just the complexity of the game, but I think that is a big component. And when we have deck boxes for single decks that are of this scale just to hold all of the pieces in one place, I think we might have a complexity problem. All right, so let's look at the numbers. How do we quantify this complexity that we seem to sense within Magic the Gathering? I think we can probably take a look first at just the text on the cards. How many rules and abilities are on new creatures? How many different things modern Magic cards can do? I think that's really relevant to the complexity, but I don't know if that accounts for all of it. See, when we look at the total number of words printed on Magic cards, it tells a pretty shocking story. But if we normalize that data, if we take the number of cards printed every year and look at purely the number of words per card on average, we can see that that trend becomes a little more temperate. It is going up. There is a complexity in the wordiness of cards, but it's not as severe as I think a lot of people might think. If we look at the total number of cards that have been printed every year, they break into a variety of different formats and styles, and there's also some variation between each of those individual groups. We're not going to analyze that right now, though I do think it's interesting to look at the complexity of Commander cards or Modern Horizons cards versus something like a standard set, or even the new set coming out, Foundations, which is supposed to be a simpler pass at Magic. I think it would be really interesting to look at that word count. But we want to look at something else. We want to look at the complexity of cards in Magic the Gathering when it comes to what I'm going to call table debris, right? The other things that end up on the table. This is one of the things that originally drew me to Magic, is that your entire game fits in a deck box. All you need is 60 or 100 cards, and you can sit down at a table with other people and play the game. That's still true, but it becomes a lot harder to keep track of all of the tokens that come into play and all of the counters that you have to put on those cards. So let's take a look at that. If we're talking tokens and counters, what impact has that had over time on Magic the Gathering? First, we can look at tokens. How many tokens have been released every year? Not just the tokens themselves, but the cards that make the tokens. That's really what we care about. And if we look at the chart, it's gone up. It's gone up a lot. And even when we normalize that for the total number of cards made each year, we still see that severe upward trend. There are a lot of cards that make tokens right now. And obviously part of that is sets specifically designed around making tokens. And that makes sense. But every set makes treasure tokens. Lots of sets make clues and food, and a lot of these evergreen tokens that now come into play in tracking the monarch and day and night cycle and all of these other things just add stuff to the table, right? You are no longer playing with 7 cards in your hand. You're playing with 7 cards that become 10 cards once they come into play. And then beyond tokens, when we look at counters, we see a similar story. There's a lot of counters being printed every year that didn't really exist before. And when we normalize it, it's still very high. In these two cases, I think it's also worth noting that looking at the non-normalized numbers and just the total number of cards made that create tokens and or counters, going up like that enables you to make an entire commander deck centered around tokens and counters and other odd complexities of the game. And that can lead to a very complicated board state. So what do we do? In this world where more cards are being printed all the time that make more table debris, how do we combat that? And more importantly, should we combat that? See, I think when we build a Magic deck, there's a few different things that we keep in mind. The first, for most of us, is budget. How much we plan on spending on the deck and how much we plan on spending on each individual card. We might have some limit, like $5 per card and $100 per deck for a somewhat low budget deck, or more if we want to spend the money for it. Alternatively, we might consider power levels and metagames. Which cards are good? Which strategies are successful in your local meta? Or we might look at the gameplay that we are trying to promote. Maybe there's a uniqueness factor, something that we want to do differently. Maybe it's a combo or a weird interaction that we want to showcase. But something that I think gets left off of this conversation about deck building is mental load. Thinking about how complicated the deck is to play in a game. Right? The number of tokens that you're making and the ways that the cards interact and the things that you have to consider on your opponent's side of the field and your side of the field can be overwhelming. And if you want to play a marathon 6 or 7 game session of Commander, you might run into some issues with just staying focused and making the right choices throughout the game. So in this world of complexity, where you can add so many components to the table that it becomes difficult to remember all of your triggers, and even the broad strategy of your deck, I think we do need to consider mental load. I think we need to go back and think about what our gameplay looks like in practice. Today, I want to talk about a deck that I've been working on. About a week ago, I posted a poll to ask which commander I should build around next, and I wanted something that's centered on the attack phase. I put up a few options, but there was one in the comments that really came out ahead, and that was Brudiclad. I think people are intrigued by Brudiclad and have been since it came out several years ago. See, Brudiclad is a token-based commander, and it really creates a lot of debris on the table. But it does a good job of simplifying that debris. Every attack phase, it makes its own token, a 2-1 mirror, and then makes all of your tokens the same as one token. It makes it very easy to keep track of. That means you can turn all of your tokens into treasures, or all of your tokens into mirrors. Whatever token you have can be copied across the rest of your tokens of whatever type. So having a deck that produces a lot of tokens is really good for Brudiclad. But I've noticed that a lot of the Brudiclad decks win off of some sort of token copy of another creature in play. Right? If you can make all of your creatures into copies of Combat Celebrant, you get infinite attack phases and probably win the game. If you make token copies of Blightsteel Colossus, you can probably just attack through for the win off of Infect. We want to do something a little bit different, a little more linear and straightforward and simple, because we want to build a component-heavy deck, very token-heavy, that is also light on mental load. So let's walk through the Brudiclad deck. I'm not going to go through every card in the deck. In fact, the deck isn't even finished yet. I'm designing this from the top down with a specific interaction in mind and building the deck around it. It's a little bit slow to be any real competitive deck, but I think it can do some really interesting, unique things. See, Brudiclad can turn all of your tokens into copy of target token in play. So you need a lot of cards that make tokens. So things like Descent into Avernus is very strong. And then a lot of Brudiclad decks have other spells that just put 1/1 Goblin tokens into play, or Mirror tokens, or Progenitor Golem tokens into play. A variety of different ways. The problem with this is that you have a lot of cards in your deck that don't actually move you towards your game plan. So we want to stay a little bit light on our token production. Now, the interaction that we are looking to foster with this deck is using some sort of Proteus staff style polymorph, flip cards off the top till you hit a creature deck. And the way that we're going to make that work is our entire deck is going to have a singular creature in it. And I walked through some of the options that we have. Obviously, we want a creature that cares about tokens, and we want a creature that hopefully is strong enough on its own to survive. And the creature that I landed on was Astral Dragon. Now, Astral Dragon has a decent body, but when it comes into play, it puts 2 3/3 flying dragon creature tokens into play. And those tokens are also copies of an artifact or enchantment we control. So this means that now our Brudiclad can make a whole bunch of copies of one of our artifacts or enchantments, except that they are also 3/3 creatures. Now we have a variety of options we can go for here. If we copy something like Propaganda, and we have a bunch of these tokens out, our opponent can't attack us unless they pay 6, 8, 10 mana per creature attacking, and that's pretty cool. It's defensive, it's kind of strategic, seems fun. Completely folds to a board wipe, bad idea. We can go offensive and run things like Shared Animosity. Cool card. Now we effectively have a one-sided coat of arms where each of our dragons buffs themselves by all of the other dragons that are in play, times the number of dragons that you have in play. It's a lot. You pretty much one-shot the table with it. And that's a cool idea. Orcish Oriflame gives a slight attack boost and acts as sort of a backup to that. There's a variety of different offensive options. But even that, I think, might be a little bit too fragile. Our opponents could have blockers, they could have ways to interact with creatures, they could just cast a fog. So we want to do something a little bit different than that. And it got me thinking about cards that care about being creatures that are not creatures. And I landed on vehicles. See, Brudiclad wants to put a bunch of creature tokens into play. And vehicles are really efficient creatures that need smaller creatures to crew them in order to do their thing. But with Astral Dragon, the 3/3 dragon tokens that you make can also be the vehicle. So these vehicles become creatures automatically. We can shove a bunch of other stuff into our deck that turns vehicles into creatures on their own to give that added value, but ultimately the interaction that we are looking for, and it's from the new set, Out of Bloomburrow, is the hamster ball. The Hamsphere. It's amazing. If you play your Astral Dragon off of a polymorph, and you have 2 other tokens in play. So you have the 2 new dragons, and 1 or 2 other tokens, and you have Brudiclad in play. This is a lot to get in one turn, but that's why we're playing a control shell. Most of our deck is around stalling the game, locking up the board, and relying on our vehicles to be attackers and blockers as needed to stay alive. But if we can keep the ham sphere alive, which also makes tokens if we can crew it, when the Astral Dragon comes down and we make 2 3/3 flying copies of the ham sphere, and then our Brudiclad puts a 2/1 token into play, if we have a 4th or 5th token, we now have 4 or 5 of those ham spheres. On attack, each one is going to put 3 hamster tokens into play, and then deal damage equal to the total number of hamster tokens we have in play. This means that we are going to be dealing 3, 6, 9, 12, 15 damage in individual chunks. And then all of our ham spheres are going to get bigger based on the number of hamsters we have in play. So each one is going to get plus 12, plus 12, plus 15, plus 15, and we're swinging for lethal, almost guaranteed. But on top of that, if for some reason they can stop us, we now have an army of hamster tokens, which Brudiclad can turn into more ham spheres, or more of whatever we end up with. Other cards, like the Reaver Titan from the 40k series, each opponent loses 5 life whenever the Titan attacks, and you make a bunch of copies of it and swing. That's usually enough. If you're using the Train from the Fallout series, can be really good with buffing your creatures. You can use the Skyship Weatherlight. There's a couple of them that are pretty useful. There's a variety of different vehicles that all have different effects, and by turning them into 3/3 flying creatures, you can get those effects immediately. That's the direction I want to go with Brudiclad. You are only ever focused on the cards that you have in play. All of your tutors are for 1 or 2 specific cards so that you can get that combo online and eliminate your opponent in one fell swoop. It reduces the amount of mental load for a commander that's very component heavy. Typically, this is juggling a lot of different pieces and trying to fit the puzzle pieces together to make a cohesive strategy that finds a win. Multipath combo decks are great, and I really enjoy them, but they're taxing to play. Last night I was playing a Necro Bloom deck, and it got to the point where I froze. I couldn't find the right route to win the game, and I went back and forth and ended up having to pass multiple times on my turn because I had too many pieces, and I spun my wheels a bunch, got a bunch of tokens into play, but didn't quite close out the game. And it took me 3 tries to actually get the win. And I probably could have gotten it on the first pass if I was able to find it. But the reality was I'd been playing Magic for 4 or 5 hours, and I was already spent. I'm hoping that this Brudiclad deck, despite being token heavy, despite having these combo lines, is a little bit easier to pilot, a little more straightforward, and a little more streamlined. So I'd encourage you, when you're building your next deck, think not only about what you want the deck to do and how you want to play it, but how much you have to think about it while you're playing it. CEDH is super fun, and playing competitively can be thrilling, but it's also really taxing. And if you're building all of your decks around this Rube Goldberg machine of millions of moving pieces all coming together in perfect harmony, you might burn yourself out. So let's simplify a little bit, build some more straightforward decks, and enjoy the conversation around the table while we play. It's been nice talking to you.